The summer of 1526 settled over the Carpathian Basin with a heat that pressed down on the rolling plains, turning the grass brittle under the hooves of cavalry. The air itself seemed heavy with the tension of an empire on the edge. Hungary, once a bulwark against Eastern incursions, now faced a threat unlike any before. The Ottoman Empire, expanding with relentless momentum, had already absorbed the Balkans and advanced towards Central Europe with an army that dwarfed most European forces of the age. The strategic stakes could not have been higher. For centuries, the Hungarian kingdom had served as a buffer between Christendom and the Ottoman advance. Now, under King Louis II, that buffer was under siege, both politically and militarily. The political landscape of Hungary was fractured. Nobles quarreled over land and influence, their private armies loyal more to family honor than the crown. The monarchy, young and inexperienced, lacked the unified authority necessary to marshal these factions into a cohesive defense. Yet, in 1526, there remained a lingering hope that discipline and strategy could offset the numerical inferiority against the Ottomans. Europe watched with cautious interest. The fall of Hungary would open a gateway into the heart of the continent, an outcome that would ripple across courts from Vienna to Rome. At the center of this crisis was King Louis II, barely 18, caught between competing pressures of his advisors and the imminence of invasion. In the months leading to the confrontation at Mohács, he faced impossible choices. He could consolidate his forces near the fortified western strongholds, hoping to draw the Ottoman army into a protracted campaign that would stretch their supply lines. Or he could advance to meet them in the open plains, leveraging mobility and terrain in a decisive strike. Intelligence reports were conflicting, drawn from a network of scouts and envoys who struggled to convey the size and composition of the approaching Ottoman host. The Hungarian command had to act without certainty, a constant feature of warfare in this era. The Ottoman army, led by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, was a force refined through decades of campaigns. Every unit had a purpose. Disciplined janissaries armed with muskets and bows, cavalry units trained to exploit gaps in enemy formations, artillery that could reshape the battlefield long before hand-to-hand combat began. Suleiman understood the psychological weight of presence. His army did not simply march. It dominated a landscape, announcing an inevitability of conquest. For the Hungarians, awareness of this strength was both a warning and a challenge. They could not afford hesitation. To linger was to invite encirclement. To advance was to risk annihilation. Yet the Hungarian strategy was not without merit. Intelligence suggested that the Ottoman force, while large, was stretched along extended supply lines. There were natural choke points and river crossings that could be exploited. The plains of Mohács, while flat and open, provided some defensive options if approached with disciplined formation and timely use of cavalry reserves. Every decision now rested on predicting the unpredictable. When the Ottomans would strike, how their artillery would be deployed, and whether the Hungarian forces could maintain cohesion under stress. The Hungarian army itself reflected the kingdom's social structure. Heavy cavalry drawn from the nobility, lightly armored infantry from towns and villages, and a scattering of mercenary units, some loyal, some only in it for pay. These disparate elements were skilled individually, but their coordination would be tested as never before. Communication relied on trumpet calls, flag signals, and the instinct of commanders, all of which could fail under the din of battle. King Louis, aware of his own inexperience, leaned heavily on his more seasoned advisors. Yet even they struggled to project authority over an army with internal rivalries and local loyalties. As the weeks passed, the Ottoman vanguard approached the Danube and the surrounding plains. Scouts reported movement in the early morning mist. Columns of infantry interspersed with cavalry squadrons, artillery pieces glinting in the sun. The psychological tension among the Hungarian forces was palpable. Nobles argued over positioning, while infantry commanders sought assurances about the reliability of their horsemen. Sleep became erratic. The constant fear of sudden attack created a background hum of anxiety. Every decision was weighed not just for its tactical value, but for its ability to maintain morale in men already wary of their own leadership. Meanwhile, Suleiman's approach was methodical. The Ottomans did not rush. Their strength lay not in rash engagement, but in calculated pressure. Supply trains moved deliberately, Scouts and light cavalry screened the flanks, and artillery units began to survey the plains, looking for advantageous terrain. Suleiman understood that the psychological edge, showing strength before the battle even began, could erode Hungarian cohesion. Report of Ottoman discipline filtered back through spies and deserters, painting a picture of an enemy whose organization and experience far outstripped anything the Hungarians had faced in decades. Within the Hungarian Council of War, debate raged. Some argued for consolidation along natural barriers, using forests and rivers to limit the effectiveness of Ottoman cavalry. Others, including the king's more aggressive counselors, pressed for an early strike, believing that surprise and speed could offset numerical inferiority. Every option carried risk. Every delay increased pressure. The stakes were more than military. They were existential. Hungary had endured invasions before, but never from foes so well-equipped, so strategically disciplined, and so psychologically intimidating. The choice ultimately leaned toward confrontation. Retreat risked emboldening Suleiman, potentially ceding territory and undermining the kingdom's fragile morale. And yet, advancing meant committing to a single battlefield, where every misstep could lead to disaster. The selection of Mohács as the site of engagement was not accidental. The plain was wide enough to maneuver cavalry and infantry, yet contained ridges and small waterways that, if correctly positioned, could provide defensive leverage. Intelligence suggested that Ottoman forces would be slowed by their artillery and baggage trains, a small but crucial advantage if the Hungarians could maintain formation and strike decisively. In the days preceding the battle, Hungarian commanders worked to arrange their forces with painstaking attention to detail. Cavalry units were arrayed in wings, prepared to envelop or counterattack as needed. Infantry formed tight blocks, reinforced at intervals with mercenary pikemen. Artillery, limited in both number and range, was positioned to cover the approaches most likely to be exploited by Ottoman scouts. Even these preparations carried uncertainty. Terrain maps were imperfect, and the behavior of the enemy could not be predicted with certainty. Every decision was a gamble, informed by skill, experience, and the understanding that the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. Beyond the mechanics of positioning, the human element weighed heavily. Soldiers had heard rumors of Ottoman brutality. Cities sacked, villages razed, prisoners enslaved. Fear was a constant companion, gnawing at resolve. Yet so, too, was the hope that disciplined leadership and the valor of Hungarian knights could hold the line. Psychological tension became tactical tension. Commanders knew that panic could spread faster than any charge. Hesitation could be exploited by a cunning foe. Maintaining morale became as crucial as arranging formations or allocating reserves. As the sun rose on the morning of August 29th, 1526, the plain of Mohács stretched under an oppressive heat. Dust rose from the earth, catching the light in swirling patterns. From distant ridges, scouts could see the Ottoman columns moving with disciplined precision. Trumpet calls echoed faintly from the Hungarian lines as commanders checked the alignment of units, ensured their banners were visible, and transmitted final orders. The quiet before the storm was deceptive. The battlefield itself seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the clash that would determine the fate of a kingdom. This was a confrontation born not only of military strategy but of circumstance, political fragmentation, and the weight of historical forces. A small Hungarian army, assembled from a patchwork of loyalists, mercenaries, and noble retinues, faced the might of an empire at its zenith. Each man understood, consciously or not, that the coming hours would test the limits of courage, discipline, and the fragile calculus of command. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the horizon of this flat plain, Suleiman observed with the confidence of a leader who had waged countless campaigns, his mind already anticipating the maneuvering, the pressure, and inevitable decisions that would unfold as battle commenced. The stage was set. The tension of two worlds, fragmented Europe and ascendant Ottoman power, converged on a single plain. Every hedge, every rise in the terrain, every formation of troops would matter. And as the first flags began to flutter in the morning wind, a question lingered in the minds of the Hungarian commanders. Could strategy, discipline, and audacity overcome the sheer weight of an empire poised to strike? The plain of Mohács stretched out like a polished floor beneath the summer sun, deceptively calm, yet brimming with the latent energy of thousands of soldiers waiting to collide. On the Hungarian side, The army was arrayed with painstaking attention to detail. Heavy cavalry, the backbone of the kingdom's defense, was positioned on the wings, their lances gleaming in the morning light, bridles taut, riders tense. Each squadron consisted of nobles who had fought in skirmishes before, their armor polished and their horses trained to respond instantly to commands. In the center, infantry units formed dense blocks, a combination of pikemen and foot soldiers whose cohesion would be tested to its limit. Limited artillery, both cumbersome and inaccurate over long ranges, was placed to cover the most likely avenues of Ottoman approach. Every formation reflected a balance of necessity and hope, a fragile attempt to compensate for what the Hungarians could not match in numbers. The Ottomans, by contrast, presented an almost theatrical display of military order. Columns stretched for kilometers across the plain, each unit rehearsed in its function. Janissaries armed with muskets and bows, their discipline unparalleled. Cavalry poised to exploit openings, light infantry ready to flank and harass, and artillery crews methodically placing their pieces on elevations to dominate the battlefield. Suleiman's command was fluid but precise, a network of officers empowered to adjust formations on the fly, ensuring that momentum could be maintained even under Hungarian pressure. From the outset, the psychological impact of this organization was clear. Even at a distance, the Hungarian troops could sense the weight of coordinated power moving against them. The terrain itself was deceptively significant. While the plains offer room for maneuver, subtle undulations, watercourses, and marshy patches introduced uncertainty. The Hungarians hoped to exploit these features, placing units where the ground would slow or channel Ottoman cavalry, forcing them into predictable paths. Yet any miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. A single boggy patch could disorganize a wing. A shallow rise could expose infantry to deadly artillery fire. Commanders had to remain vigilant, continuously adjusting signals and orders while maintaining formation. In an age without radios or telegraphs, communication relied entirely on line-of-sight flags, trumpet calls, and the instinctive response of troops who had drilled for these exact scenarios. For the Hungarian soldiers, the psychological pressure was acute. They were outnumbered, yet determined. Reports of Ottoman brutality in past campaigns traveled ahead of Suleiman's army like a shadow, creating a sense of foreboding. Knights paced within their ranks, adjusting armor and reins, some silently praying, others exchanging terse words of reassurance. Infantry gripped pikes and swords, aware that their survival would depend not only on personal courage, but on the discipline of those around them. In the rear, commanders weighed every risk, aware that hesitation or miscommunication could trigger panic, a contagion that spreads faster than enemy arrows. The first movements of the Ottomans confirmed what Hungarian scouts had suspected. Janissaries advanced in coordinated lines, their musket volleys timed to soften targets before cavalry struck. Artillery fired intermittently, probing formations and testing the discipline of the Hungarian infantry. Light cavalry on the flanks skirmished, drawing out isolated units and attempting to force premature commitments. The Hungarians responded with measured counteractions. Wings adjusted to absorb cavalry probes, infantry braced for volleys, and limited artillery returned fire where range permitted. Every engagement was a microcosm of tension. The thunder of musket fire, the clatter of hooves, the shouted orders of officers trying to impose structure on the chaos. King Louis II and his commanders understood that their window for decisive action was narrow. The Ottoman superior mobility and firepower meant that prolonged exposure without taking initiative could be fatal. Yet, striking too early risked overextension, exposing flanks to enveloping attacks. Hungarian strategy hinged on maintaining formation while selectively engaging, an approach that demanded not only skill, but an extraordinary degree of composure under pressure. Every soldier felt this tension. Every unit had to act as part of a larger mechanism, or risk fracturing under the Ottoman weight. Cavalry maneuvers became the defining feature of the engagement's early hours. Hungarian heavy cavalry moved in disciplined arcs, attempting to threaten Ottoman flanks, while remaining anchored to the infantry center. Ottoman response was immediate. Their own mounted units pivoted, countering the Hungarian approach with speed and precision. Here, the psychological dimension of battle became apparent. Each charge carried the potential for breakthrough, but also the risk of disorder. A single disrupted squadron could unravel a flank, creating openings that Janissaries could exploit with deadly effect. Commanders on both sides read and reread these movements constantly, adapting to the slightest shift in alignment, the subtle hesitation of a unit, or the sudden collapse of morale in a small group of soldiers. Meanwhile, the center of the Hungarian line faced relentless artillery fire. Ottoman cannons, positioned on gentle rises, peppered the infantry blocks, creating smoke, confusion, and casualties. Soldiers gritted their teeth and held formation, understanding that breaking ranks under fire would invite disaster. Leaders moved among the troops, reinforcing cohesion with commands, visual signals, and, when necessary, physical presence. The noise was disorienting. The thunder of cannon, the whine of arrows, the pounding of hooves, the shouts of wounded men. It was in this crucible that the discipline of the Hungarian army was tested, and where individual courage intertwined with collective endurance. Suleiman's strategy combined pressure with patience. He sought to probe weaknesses, induce premature attacks, and exploit hesitation. His forces were large enough to absorb minor setbacks without compromising the overall plan. Hungarian forces, in contrast, were executing a high-stakes gamble, holding the line while seeking the moment to disrupt the Ottoman advance. Both sides understood that control of tempo, the ability to dictate when and where engagements occurred, would determine the outcome. As the engagement progressed, Hungarian commanders began to execute small, deliberate offensives designed to harass and distract, rather than to rout. Light cavalry skirmished at the edges of the plain, drawing Ottoman units into overextended positions. Pikemen advanced in carefully measured formations, testing gaps in the janissary lines while remaining tethered to the main body. Each action carried both tactical and psychological significance, demonstrating resistance, maintaining morale, and subtly shaping the battlefield in ways that might yield advantage as the confrontation intensified. Amid the noise and chaos, battlefield confusion became a constant threat. Signals were misread, units momentarily lost cohesion, and skirmishes flared unpredictably. Commanders had to make instantaneous decisions, whether to reinforce a threatened flank, order a retreat to consolidate, or push an advance in hopes of creating a critical opening. Each choice had cascading consequences. A successful maneuver could ripple across the battlefield, while a miscalculation could trigger panic. Soldiers responded not only to commands but to the behavior of those around them, creating a feedback loop in which perception, fear, and initiative intertwined. By mid-morning, the engagement had reached a sustained intensity. Cannon fire left cratered earth across the plain, cavalry charges shredded pockets of infantry, and the air vibrated with the relentless rhythm of conflict. Both armies had absorbed initial shocks, tested formations, and probed weaknesses. For the Hungarian forces, the critical question remained: could their disciplined strategic patience and targeted use of cavalry exploit a momentary lapse in the Ottoman advance? For Suleiman, the challenge was to maintain pressure, manage fatigue across a vast army, and anticipate the unexpected cunning of an outnumbered, yet determined, opponent. Throughout these early hours, psychological tension remained as potent as physical pressure. Soldiers fought not only to kill or hold ground, but to survive in a maelstrom of unpredictability. The discipline of units, the presence of leadership, and the careful timing of maneuvers were all under scrutiny. A single misstep could cascade into disorder. A single bold action could tip the balance. In this interplay of strategy, fear, and opportunity, the battlefield became not just a stage for combat, but a theater of human endurance, decision-making, and resolve. By noon, the Hungarian forces had achieved what few expected. Despite overwhelming Ottoman numbers, they remained largely cohesive. Cavalry continued to execute flanking feints. Infantry absorbed bombardment with minimal disruption, and command maintained a clear picture of the battlefield. Yet the strain was visible. Fatigue, heat, and constant threat weighed heavily on every man. Leadership, both formal and informal, had become essential to maintaining focus. The Hungarian army had not yet won the battle, but it had bought time, maintained formation, and preserved the possibility that strategy, audacity, and careful exploitation of terrain could create a decisive advantage. As the sun climbed higher, the clash entered a critical phase. The Hungarian wings, having absorbed initial assaults, prepared for coordinated strikes intended to destabilize the Ottoman advance. Infantry formations braced for renewed artillery barges, while command signals moved along the line. relayed by trumpet and flag. Every soldier, from noble knight to conscripted footman, understood the stakes. In this hour, the cohesion of the army, the timing of maneuvers, and the discipline of units would determine not only victory or defeat, but the survival of the kingdom itself. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every principle of command, the resilience of every soldier, and the strategic acumen of leaders on both sides. The plain of Mohács had become a crucible, a place where preparation met chaos, where numbers met cunning, and where human psychology intertwined with the mechanics of warfare. The coming moments would define the battle, and perhaps the course of history itself. As the afternoon sun rose high over the plain of Mohács, the Hungarian forces faced a moment of stark clarity. The early exchanges had tested discipline, endurance, and coordination. Cavalry charges had rippled across the flanks. Infantry had absorbed relentless artillery bombardment. Skirmishes had strained the edges of formations. Yet, the Hungarian army remained cohesive, their morale intact despite the numerical superiority of the Ottoman host. In this crucible, the psychological dimension of warfare became decisive. Each Ottoman probe, each volley of cannon fire, and each cavalry maneuver carried not only physical threat, but the potential to induce hesitation, fear, or outright panic. Commanders understood that the battle could hinge on a single, well-timed pressure point, an exploitation of a weakness in either morale, positioning, or timing. Suleiman's forces pressed steadily, attempting to overwhelm with superior numbers and coordinated attacks. The Janissaries advanced in disciplined lines, muskets and bows delivering precise volleys against infantry blocks. Cavalry on the Ottoman wings pivoted to threaten Hungarian flanks, while light infantry harassed from distance, forcing subtle adjustments in positioning. Yet, in the midst of this pressure, a critical flaw emerged. Ottoman forces, stretched across a wide front and relying on synchronized movements, were vulnerable to misalignment. Small gaps appeared between units, temporary but exploitable, as wings shifted to respond to feints and the relentless pressure of the Hungarian countermeasures. Recognizing this, Hungarian commanders began to coordinate decisive strikes. Heavy cavalry, previously used in probing flanking maneuvers, converged on points of weakness, charging with precision and timing. Infantry advanced in tight formations, supporting the cavalry and preventing overextension. Every movement was calculated to induce confusion in the Ottoman ranks, to exploit the temporary breakdowns in communication, and to magnify the impact of limited forces. In essence, the Hungarians were turning the battle into a test of control, disciplined, deliberate pressure against an enemy whose size created both strength and vulnerability. The psychological impact on Ottoman troops was immediate. Units that had operated with near-mechanical precision now hesitated as Hungarian cavalry struck exposed flanks. Artillery crews were forced to adjust rapidly to shifting threats, and infantry lines briefly wavered under concentrated attacks. The battlefield, once dominated by Ottoman organization, now displayed moments of instability. Panic, the silent predator of armies, began to ripple through the fringes. Commanders on both sides reacted in real time, attempting to restore order or press advantage. But the Hungarian strategy had created the conditions for decisive disruption. Central to this turning point was the interplay of terrain, timing, and the disciplined application of force. The Hungarian wings, using knowledge of minor undulations and waterways on the plain, funneled Ottoman cavalry into areas where their momentum was blunted. Infantry blocks, reinforced with pikemen, formed effective anchors, preventing breakthroughs while maintaining mobility for localized counterattacks. Cavalry struck not in reckless charges, but in synchronized bursts designed to destabilize rather than overextend. In this environment, numerical superiority became less decisive. Control of tempo, clarity of command, and psychological pressure emerged as the defining factors. As the hours progressed, the Ottoman army began to experience increasing fragmentation, miscommunication, and the natural delays inherent in coordinating tens of thousands of men across an open plain created temporary gaps in formations. Hungarian forces seized these moments, driving attacks that were small in scale but high in tactical significance. Panic, once confined to isolated units, began to propagate along vulnerable sections of the Ottoman line. The cohesion that had characterized Suleiman's advance wavered under sustained, precise pressure. For the first time, the momentum of the battle shifted.